Thank you all for being here this morning. Really delighted to welcome our next panel to the stage. It's a conversation I've been having with my good friend Kellie Meiman Hock for a while. We wanted to have this conversation. We were talking, as I've mentioned, about the national security strategy and how it's sort of been a theme of this conference. And the White House's renewed or new focus on the Western Hemisphere has been front and center in that conversation. And I've been talking with Kellie about this and delighted for her to be here and to work with us to pull this panel together. Kellie is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, a board member of the Inter-American Dialogue, and a former director of Brazil and the Southern Cone at USTR. Diego Marroquín Bitar is a fellow of the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ambassador Mariana Pacheco is an external consultant at Araujo Ibarra and a former ambassador of Colombia to India and a former deputy chief of mission at the Embassy of Colombia in the United States. Kellyanne Shaw is a partner at Akin, former deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs and deputy director of the National Economic Council in Trump 1. And Ricardo Zuniga is a founding partner at Dinámica Americas, former principal deputy assistant secretary and special envoy for the Northern Triangle in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Thank you all very much for joining us. Kellie, take it away.
Ken, thank you so much. Thanks for everything you do for us in the trade community and for this platform and for doing an entire panel on Latin America. Who would have thought? This is kind of the collision of my two nerd worlds, Latin America and trade. And covering the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and its impact on hemispheric trade, I think, is quite timely. I know I was in the room, maybe others on the panel were as well, in November of 2013, when Secretary Kerry declared in a speech at the Organization of American States that the Monroe Doctrine was dead. And all of us thought that we might be turning the page on an era where I think it's fair to say that Latin America suffered from kind of a combo of, in some cases, benign neglect, in some cases, well-intentioned policies like the Summit of the Americas or the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and in other cases, less benign interventionism, right? And so what we see with this reboot, really less of the Monroe Doctrine, and more of the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, which, back about 100 years ago, that was a more kind of interventionist version, if you will, of the Monroe Doctrine. I don't have to say that with a Colombian on the panel, 1903, when we supported Panamanian independence to build the canal. That's really kind of this new era that we are living in. And the new national security strategy, still relatively new from November, which really first delineated this. I think for those of us that work on Latin America, we're used to kind of being a bit of an afterthought. So to see the Western Hemisphere on page 5 and China not mentioned till page 19 was a little weird. And so I think a lot of us were trying to figure out what does that mean and how is this going to impact the issues that we work on, not just in the national security realm, but also in the trade realm. So no person better, Kellyanne, than you, who worked in the first Trump White House, to help us to decipher some of this. I mean, what does it mean writ large? How do you see this new policy and this new prioritization of the hemisphere manifesting itself? Feel free to comment on writ large, but certainly with respect to the trade agenda and how we are kind of melding these worlds of national security and economic security. Monica DeBoll, the economist at the Peterson Institute from Brazil, recently wrote a piece saying it's all about China. Is it?
So great questions. And first of all, thank you to you for moderating this panel and to my fellow panelists and to Wida. It's always a pleasure to serve on a panel with another Kellie. So look, I think this is very interesting. And when the national security strategy came out, of course, the headline was about the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine being the headline and hardly any mention of China at all, in stark contrast to other iterations of national security strategies we've seen, including under Trump's first administration, where some of the language used was quite different. But, to your point about some observations about sort of like reading below the top line and and what's actually happening, I actually think a good chunk of this national security strategy and the Monroe Doctrine in particular are focused on China. And while the word China does not appear, if you read the substance of all of the paragraphs and subparagraphs that outline the strategic building blocks of what the administration is trying to accomplish in terms of keeping adversaries out of the Western Hem, right? That's code for China. In terms of even some of the economic security provisions of that. So this is mostly about peace through strength. It's about balance and fairness in terms of the US national security approach. But when it comes to economic integration in the Western Hemisphere, you have the building blocks of fairness and reciprocity, which are part of these negotiated art deals. You also have access to strategic minerals and to strategic supply chains. That is, of course, coded China and other potential adversaries, making sure that we are dependent where we have these really important supply chains. There are things that have been negotiated into these deals with Latin American countries that address things like export controls, investment restrictions, and other types of economic security issues that are, again, very clearly directed at trying to keep Chinese influence out of the market. And the piece we haven't seen come yet in any of these art deals, but most assuredly will be at some point, are changes to rules of origin. And because we're a trade crowd and we go in the weeds on this, like that is about keeping Chinese content out of these supply chains and making sure that Chinese content isn't benefiting from the preferences that we're giving some of our closest hemispheric trading partners. And so I very much see that as the direction of travel. And one example I'll sort of leave you with is the 4 Latin American deals that were negotiated had special provisions on textiles. And it provided this concept of destacking. So under our tariff rates, textiles are subject to some of the highest, most favored nation rates. Some of them go up to 20% and higher. So you have whatever the previous reciprocal rate, now 122 rate is, plus you have MFN on top of that. So you're talking about some very, very high tariff rates. What the Trump administration negotiated with a number of Latin American partners was this destacking, meaning they're trying to encourage the textile supply chain to not be as integrated in Southeast Asia and instead to relocate to South and Latin America. And so I see US trade policy evolving in a way that supports the national security objectives outlined in this national security strategy and very much being part and parcel and tied to this Trump corollary of this Monroe Doctrine revive.
I'm really glad that you raised the economic and national security components of the arts, because I know that's something I've been kind of obsessed with, to see the variations between what Guatemala committed to and El Salvador and Argentina, and we'll see what Ecuador commits to. I'm wondering how you think those components might play themselves out, for example, in the USMCA, because obviously it's been an effort, going back, even the Biden administration, trying to get our tariff levels with some of our trading partners when it comes to third-party actors, read also China, trying to get them more equalized. I mean, not to say we'd have a common external tariff or anything of that nature, but at least to have a bit more of a common front when it comes to imports from China. How do you see that playing out? Will there be reverberation beyond the arts into other discussions?
Yeah, I mean, certainly USMCA is going to be a prime example of how far the administration is going to take its economic pillar of the Monroe Doctrine. And part of that is as you raised, there is a concern that Chinese content and Chinese companies are benefiting from current USMCA rules because of the rules of origin, which basically say you only have to account for that last phase of substantial transformation, even if everything else in that supply chain is from China. So they are almost certainly going to try to address that challenge in certain key sectors. I think that if we weren't in a détente with China, if we weren't in this one-year pause, you'd actually see the administration pursuing this much more aggressively. But they are going to have to balance some tension here of wanting to, again, create this, as you said, not quite a customs union with Canada and Mexico, but a more robust economic relationship where we're adopting similar external tariffs and external policies, and we're lowering barriers to trade within each other's economy, with not wanting to totally throw the relationship with China off a cliff right now while we are still dependent on China for critical minerals, rare earths, rare earth magnets. So this is a little bit of a dance at the moment. But that said, Canada and Mexico are the US's two closest trading partners by volume. And for that reason, I do think that you're probably going to have the two most willing trading partners to engage in this exercise with the United States. I think that more ambitiously, Latin America would follow, South America would follow, but this is going to be a bit of a work in progress until we get other countries comfortable with taking on the same challenges of excess capacity, overcapacity, and distorted trade that has caused the United States to implement some of these tariffs with respect to China in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say everyone's worried about Chinese overcapacity, right? Everyone. And I think especially given our trade actions against China, I mean, that stuff is going somewhere. And if it's not going here, Ricardo, sometimes it's going elsewhere in Latin America. And want to get your perspective on Latin America, writ large, and the China challenge, and also specifically to the commitments that have been made in the trade agreements thus far vis-a-vis China. Those obligations are going to be tough, right? Because if we're looking at the countries in Latin America, both that have agreements already or have frameworks or at least are talking to the administration, they're all kind of between two superpowers right now, right? And trying to dance that dance. How hard will that be for them? What are the dynamics that you see at play? And how many of those dynamics, or if any, might alter in light of Friday's Supreme Court determination?
Thanks very much, Kellie. So a few pieces. I think Kellie laid out very well what the kind of the general perspective that is well understood in the Americas. And the closer you are to the United States, I think you want to put these in three categories. There's Mexico, there's North America, there's Central America and the Caribbean, and there's South America. And they all bring very different perspectives to this particular issue, because their exposure to the US market is different in each case, and where they make their money is different. So politics matter right now in the Americas, and there's certainly a shift to the right and more governments that are aligned with the Trump administration and want to be seen that way, but the trade won't necessarily follow. And your question is, how hard is it going to be to implement, for example, in the case of the Guatemala agreement, what was a significant, and I thought, very interesting expansion of our export controls to another market, which I think it's a good experiment to see if that, how that plays out. But in the short term, very low capacity to actually enforce that kind of control on the part of bureaucracies that are simply unaccustomed to it. They're not unused to the United States putting pressure on China. I can tell you in the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration, and this administration, these are economies and governments that have been hearing from the United States about the need that they want to compete more effectively with China, but part of that also means working in greater concert and understanding how China is distorting the global economy. That message is understood. Like you said, there are many who would welcome an opportunity to deal with Chinese overcapacity. But right now, I think it's very early days, and they're dealing with disruption more than they are looking at advantages that they can garner from these arrangements. The IEEPA decision, I think that countries had become accustomed to the notion that they were going to negotiate agreements where there was essentially access to the US market built on top of an existing FTA or built on top of an existing trade agreement, new restrictions and new tariffs that hadn't existed before but that they could deal with, where they would have a comparative advantage to Asia, for instance. With the IEEPA decision, I think that many of them are kind of reevaluating how they're going to accomplish this and what kinds of challenges they're going to face in terms of access. I will say the Section 122 decision, the cutout for textiles from under the CAFTA terms was very significant, because
and keeping the USMCA.
Thank you.
Out, yeah.
That's right, and exactly the same thing. And so what you're seeing is that I think I'll just end this portion this way. In a world where they see this level of disruption, they're all angling for relative access, relative advantages compared to their neighbors, their immediate neighbors. So had the Section 122 provision that came out had a 15% global tariff instead of 10%, that would have been a tremendous advantage for some of the Central American countries that would have been less affected in one of their primary exports in textiles. But they're all, these are not unsophisticated governments. They're just trying to find a clear path that they can negotiate. They are very willing for the most part. Again, as you move towards South America, there's less and less and less willingness, the greater their exports are to China, to cooperate with us in terms of the relationship with China. You can have, and I'll just give this example, the president of Chile, very much aligned with President Trump's agenda, no question about that. He has no intention of disrupting Chile's very valuable exports of primarily copper and other critical minerals to China, because his private sector won't go along with that. And that's the other factor.
The transition coming up too. I mean, so we'll remain committed to the agreements, is the bottom line I'm hearing, and maybe hoping that the president's tweet on Saturday comes true so they have a bit more comparative advantage. You mentioned that a number of the countries in the region are aligned with the president. We have had a shift towards the right in Latin America in recent years. If I'm not wrong, there's a summit coming up March 7th in Florida. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Who's invited? What's it about? What are the goals? And how will it link, if at all, to some of what the president's trying to do in his preparations for his China trip?
Well, it's great timing for this event because it's all about hemispheric security. And when you hear hemispheric security, that means China. It can also mean counter-narcotics. It can also mean migration. But in the case of these invitees, it's really about China. And it is the most sort of ideologically aligned leaders, but not all of them. There are a couple who are going to be missing, and I think that's important. But you're going to have the leaders of Paraguay, the leader of Bolivia, President of El Salvador, President Bukele of El Salvador. You're going to have President Milei, who's enormous, brings enormous star power. President of Paraguay, Santi Peña, who also is very close to this administration, but you're not going to have Colombia. Well, that's
no, hay que decirlo.
That one we knew.
That one we know.
But Dominican Republic is not going to be there, and that's an interesting one because the Dominican Republic has been a very successful trading partner with the United States, one of the most successful CAFTA members. But there are some challenges.
And not Chile because of the transition, because
Chile.
their inaugural is the 11th.
Exactly.
Correct? Yeah.
Exactly. And again, Costa's a very independent character as well, and he will mark that independence.
I thought it was interesting that Costa in the Panama and the CAF meetings met with President Lula. I mean, you see an ideological flexibility, I think, that at least if I were a leader from Latin America, I would seek to model with some of the governments that are, just kind of talking to who will talk to them.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, and with the exception of Paraguay, smack in the middle of South America, the farther south you go, the less, I think they feel absolutely beholden to the United States. The case of Argentina is different because of how important the United States has been in stabilizing the currency. But that's an exception. And yet, 4 of the participants have perfectly constructive relationships with China that are not going to be put on the table in this meeting.
I've read Milei is going to China.
Yes.
So
again, there is, look, what I know from talking to friends in those governments and friends in the US government is that they're not going to put, there is nuance in the administration's and President Trump's approach on this, and they're not going to force everyone to the wall. That's why there's a difference between the provisions in the art for El Salvador versus the one for Guatemala. Guatemala doesn't have a relationship with China, much more stringent requirements. El Salvador does have a relationship with China. They negotiated more flexible terms with the agreement of this USTR and this White House. So it's not one size fits all. I do want to make one important point. Even in smaller economies, even in smaller trading relationships, for those who are participating here, what we've heard in the negotiation of the arts is that USTR is very open to ideas from the private sector, very open to ideas that are aligned with the general security direction. And so even in a smaller market, the idea of putting a provision like the one that exists in Guatemala for tighter export controls, alignment on export controls, not just promises to work together, but actual alignment, That's the kind of thing that you can potentially try to get into the text of an agreement. So there is opportunity in this kind of new movement. There's less certainty, but also potentially more space for new ideas.
I'm going to come back to that because I want us to discuss more as a panel where, in what sectors those opportunities might lie, but we have to move to North America, Diego. I think that it's fair to say that there is no country in the hemisphere who has had this national security, economic security conversation entwined more than with Mexico. Migration, drugs, security, threats. Although I see my friend David Patterson, he might quibble with me. But I think Mexico is in a very unique situation there. And I think that a lot of us have looked at the way that President Sheinbaum has navigated that challenge. At least I'll speak for myself personally, with a bit of admiration, because it's not been easy, right? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that U.S.-Mexico dynamic. What are the key components at play? And just, how do you see that discussion going forward within the context of the USMCA review, of course, but more broadly, please?
Of course. I think President Sheinbaum, I agree with you, has done a tremendous job in managing continuous pressure and threats from the White House. And she's done that successfully so far, but I think the margin of error is very, very, very thin. And the stability of that progress, of Mexico keep making progress, is very fragile. Things can deteriorate very quickly, as we saw on Sunday with the events involving the killing of El Mencho, the leader of Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. I want to make 3 quick points here. Number one is that the bilateral relationship between the US and Mexico has been completely decompartmentalized. What does that mean? As you said, we no longer operate in different silos. The trade silo is completely intertwined with immigration, with security, with the environment, with energy, with water management. Security cooperation is no longer a separate track. It has become a gatekeeper for economic certainty in Mexico. If there's no security cooperation, there's not going to be economic certainty in Mexico. It is no longer for Mexico to demonstrate goodwill and to share intelligence with the US. Washington wants durable and measurable results. And failing to make progress on security allows frustrations to bleed into trade negotiations. So that's number one. Number two, there's been a complete 180-degree shift in cooperation between Mexico and the US since the end of the López Obrador administration. President Sheinbaum has, obviously, her government has engaged in record-level fentanyl and cocaine seizures. There's been a record-level number of border encounters. Over 100 alleged criminals have been transferred to the US to face justice, as long as Mexico keeps a preferential trade position. There's been a sharp increase in intelligence sharing between Mexican and US agencies. And there's, importantly enough, and we saw that over the weekend, there's been action against officials with cartel ties, as we saw with the mayor of Tequila, Jalisco. But they've also engaged in the targeting of cartel leadership, as, again, Mencho is a good example. Together, these mark a dramatic shift in US-Mexico security cooperation. But I think that the main point here is, for Washington, those things are viewed as necessary. They're not crucial. They're not going to change the tone of the conversation with Mexico. And this helps explain why, despite being more accommodating to US demands, or as USTR Jameson Green would argue, more pragmatic, for example, vis-a-vis Canada, Mexico's trade-weighted average exposure is roughly the same as Canada's. That is, despite unprecedented cooperation and visible enforcement gains, the Trump administration does not yet believe that Mexico is pulling its weight on security. And because the relationship is no longer compartmentalized, progress on USMCA extension now hinges directly on security and other outcomes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Diego, but one of the keys, at least as I've been an observer from the outside to President Sheinbaum's success in this regard, is that she was elected in part because Mexicans wanted better security, right? I mean, that was part of her brand and part of her. So it strikes me that she's been able to, from a messaging perspective and just managing her own domestic political constituencies, able to say, yeah, we're doing X, Y, and Z, and yeah, the Americans are happy we're doing it, but we're doing this for you. And she has very artfully, in my view, drawn lines, and I'm sure she's gotten an earful from the White House when, in so doing, when there are things that cross the line, like U.S. troops in Mexico. So, I mean, but I think it's important, at least when I talk to folks up in the U.S., I don't feel like there's always an understanding that like there's a real need and a desire, not just in Mexico, frankly, throughout the region. Security is desired, right? I mean, this is a priority for voters.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think the status quo of the López Obrador administration was unsustainable. And some of the things that the U.S. administration has asked the Mexican government to do, not only on security, but on other fronts, are beneficial to Mexican citizens. And she's been quite successful in communicating that to the Mexican electorate. I would only say a few things, and just going back to the original question, why this equilibrium is so fragile. She's been successful so far, but things can go very wrong very, very fast. You mentioned U.S., the potential of U.S. kinetic attacks or U.S. kinetic action on Mexican soil. That is the bilateral poison pill. As soon as that happens, economic integration is collateral damage. It's going to be very, very difficult politically for President Sheinbaum to continue to engage the Trump administration on all fronts of the bilateral relationship if something like that were to happen. And then, I mean, there's obviously one thing that we have underestimated so far is how people feel about this new security strategy. People in Jalisco and Puerto Vallarta, they're really scared. What happened over the weekend was definitely going to have an impact on investor uncertainty in the state and in Puerto Vallarta. And the public might get fatigued, just the general population, but more importantly, people in Morena I think are going to start to oppose some of these measures. And I would finish with one more argument why this is, again, a very fragile equilibrium, is how Washington keeps moving the goalposts. So Mexico has done a lot, but once you do something, the goalposts are always going to shift. And it may never be enough. We saw that, for example, with the Canadians. It's a good example. They dropped their digital services tax so that they could advance trade talks, same way that Mexico has done a lot on the security front to advance trade talks. But again, they dropped that with very limited results in the end. And I would finish with this. In asymmetric negotiations, the same way that Mexico engages the US or Canada engages the US, accommodation today can become expectation tomorrow. It can become the bare minimum tomorrow. So I think we should be wary about how much Mexico gives today, because there's always going to be more demands tomorrow.
I like what you said, accommodation today can be expectation tomorrow. I want to ask you a follow-up question with respect to steps that Mexico has taken regarding Chinese and other imports into Mexico. And as Kellyanne highlighted, rules of origin, tightening rules of origin, ensuring that USMCA is not a platform for other countries to be successful. It's a platform for North American success. What would you comment on as far as how far Mexico has gone to date? Is Mexico willing? I thought the previous panel about CFIUS was fascinating. Is Mexico willing to develop a CFIUS analog? I mean, where do you see the most interesting activity happening in that space?
But Mexico has had a much more nuanced relationship with China over the past years compared to Canada and compared to the US. But right now we've seen a lot of alignment when it comes to economic security. I think the only big item that's missing from the conversation today is the Mexican CFIUS. But I can tell you, I've spoken to some friends at the Economy Ministry in Mexico. The Mexican CFIUS is ready. They've been in conversation since December 2023, if I recall correctly. If they wanted, they could submit that to a vote in Congress. But again, this is part of a much larger negotiation. The Mexican CFIUS is just a chip to negotiate with the US. If I were a negotiator and if I implemented that today, I know for sure that the US is going to demand something else tomorrow. So they're keeping their chips right now, at least until there's no bilateral and trilateral USMCA working groups. That we were supposed to have those earlier this year, and we still don't have those. I don't think there's no appetite from the Mexican government, like thinking strategically, to start implementing some of those measures. But others, Mexico just slapped tariffs on over 1,500 goods, and they didn't say on Chinese goods. What the Mexican government said, we're putting tariffs on goods on countries that we don't have free trade agreements with. And guess which is the main country that Mexico doesn't have a free trade agreement with? It's China.
But also Korea, right? You have Korean auto plants that are suffering with that in Mexico, as I understand. So it wasn't cost-free.
No. Tariffs are always going to cost. And by putting a tariff on China and South Korea, all the electronics that, for example, we use in auto production are going to be more expensive for the region as a whole, not just for Mexico.
Mariana, you sit in Bogota, Colombia.
Yes.
My first tour in the Foreign Service. Know and love it well. It's not very far from Venezuela, which is essentially the poster child for the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I think we all woke up on January 3rd, at least I did, glued to my TV, and surprised. And would just love to get your view, and you speak beyond Colombia, please, just from the region, as far as what is the vibe around the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in region? Just would love to get your view, because I think that's something we don't always hear here in Washington.
Yeah. Well, as you have heard, I'm Colombian. We're not that friendly partner. We're not invited to the Trump Mar-a-Lago Club meeting the first week of March.
But I should have said, Mariana was Deputy Chief of Mission in the Colombian Embassy in Trump 1.0, and the relationship was
And I was
positive
director
then.
of the Trade Bureau as well a long time ago. And but I'm going to be speaking from 5,000 miles away, how we see the Trump corollary. And let me take you from a point of view of an outsider. Expectations are quite high, viewing the national security strategy. I think, as Kellie has pointed out, if we can't afford the United States to fail, I think we have a lot of expectations for this strategy to succeed. We need USMCA revision to succeed, US companies to succeed, USMCA, Mexico, Canada to succeed. If not, we will feel from up to Canada to Patagonia, we will feel that that the companies and the countries, we will feel that immediately. We need the Central America and Panama and Colombia to become the new Mexicos. We need to supply chains inside the hemisphere. We need onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, the Americas shoring. We don't care how you call it, but we need to keep investment in the region.
I thought it was interesting, Mariana, just to interrupt for a second, that Jennifer Thornton, General Counsel of USTR, when she was speaking, it leapt out at me. You know, she said that we want to move supply chains to the Western Hemisphere.
Yes,
she didn't say
she said that.
Even to the Americas or to, and that really leapt out. I mean, because you do, I feel like sometimes we get mixed messages on that.
And she said, our trade and our security is very much intertwined. So we need to keep our jobs in the hemisphere. And we can't afford failure. We need our manufacturing, we need our autos to be here, we need our agriculture to be kept here, we need our pork to be kept here, we need our flowers to be kept here. 5 million Colombians depend on the trade between Colombia and the United States, but also 5 million Americans depend on the trade between the United States and Colombia. The flower industry, the florists depend, the logistics, everything depends on our trade. So we're very much intertwined. Above all, we need jobs to stay in the region. Jobs in Mexico, in Central America, in Colombia, and in the Caribbean. Jobs that reduce migration, jobs that reduce chaos, jobs that build dignity and keep all people away from illegal drugs, illegal mining, and all illegal whatever they do in our region. And we must keep ahead of China, because if we don't, China absolutely will come to our region. And
They're already there, right? So
they're
you mean
already
intensify.
there.
Yeah.
They're already there, and I'm going to make that point right now. Uncertainty functions as a silent tax, so we need to keep our competitiveness. Where I sit in Colombia, the Trump Corollary means something that we have talked about here. We know that tariffs are here, and they're going to stay, whatever they're going to call it, 232, 301, whatever it's going to become, they're going to be here. The United States and national security lens dominates everything. Migration, security, illegal drugs, border pressures, job protection will shape trade policy far more than traditional market access principles. I don't think this is necessarily negative. It forces us, Latin American countries, to confront our own realities. I know this is something that many of my colleagues were not expecting to hear, but I think this is time for us also to face our own realities. Migration drivers, illegal drug production and trafficking, organized crime, weak institutions, domestic security challenges. Geopolitics have changed. I remember, and those words resonate still, what Prime Minister Carney said in Davos. We're shifting from a rules-based system to a world of fortress. And he says trade has been weaponized. He also said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. In the case of Colombia, we're probably the free bread that puts on the table. So we're not there yet. Third, this new national security strategy is forcing countries to choose partners, which is very dangerous for Latin America. And this is the point about China. Mm-hmm. We cannot afford in Latin America to face or to be forced to choose between the United States or China. China is already there in our countries. And this put a lot of pressure in countries that were already polarized. We can share that security. For example, we see the port of Chancay, which is 60% owned in Peru by Costco, and the US is building in the old military base another infrastructure, which is just miles away from the port of Chancay. For example, what happened in the Panama Canal, the ruling also approached and benefited US investment. And we can see that also in Colombia. There is balance between China and the US, and it can coexist. But if the US pressures our countries to choose between China and the US, that may become a political upheaval in our countries. So I think Washington needs to be more subtle about those pressures.
Kind of not our jam right now, but
Yes. Fourth, I think this new reality has forced exporters into a deeper conversation with US clients. I sit with my clients, and now there is a new conversation between suppliers and your companies. We're talking about US or resilience between supply chain forces. We're adopting artificial intelligence between Colombian suppliers and US companies. We are talking about agro-industry sourcing, for example, the problems in Ukraine and Russia and shifting to another sources. We're shifting factories across the region. For example, there are Colombian companies that are moving to El Salvador or Guatemala because of the issues with Colombia right now. And it's easy to shift inside the region, and the U.S. Companies are sort of moving and looking and talking to those companies inside the region to do so. And fifth, I would say, under the Trump corollary, economic relationships have become very bilateral. We're not talking anymore about regional economic integration. That's long gone. There is no FTA talks anymore. There are no economic integration anymore, where it's a one-on-one conversation. And I don't think we're ever going to see, an hemispheric conversation anymore. With regards to Venezuela, I think there is a great opportunity for all of us, not only Colombia, which we sit next door. 35% of your border with Mexico is the Colombia-Venezuela border. And let me say something, if Trump hadn't taken the decision to go after Maduro, it's very possible that Maduro would still be sitting in power as Venezuela's illegitimate president. So from my point of view, I would thank President Trump to have taken out Maduro out of Venezuela. I think we owe him a favor, and let's hope that Rubio's plan to have Venezuela to become stabilized, rebuilt, and then hold democratic elections down the road. We don't expect as Colombians to have soon democratic elections. Let's hope that Venezuela can be rebuilt. But let me tell you, it's a great opportunity. Only to rebuild the oil industry, we will need at least $10 billion per year to build an oil industry that was producing 2 million barrels per day in year 2000. Now we need to rebuild that oil industry again, only the oil industry, that without counting that we need to rebuild electricity, housing, just general services, that is also another $8 billion on top of that $10 billion to rebuild the oil industry. So we're sitting in a country with almost like a plan Marshall to rebuild. So it's a huge opportunity for all of us, not only the United States, but also for Colombia and the whole region to rebuild. It's not going to be easy. It's a national security issue, not only for the region, but for the world, because we just taken a country that was taken by the Chinese and by other means of illegal means. So it's going to take a while to rebuild Venezuela.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Mariana. And I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure Diego and Ricardo, you're in the same boat, of the various WhatsApp groups and dinners with wine that I've had with all my friends from all over the region. If you've got 5 people, you've got 5 different opinions about basically what's been happening in the Andean region of late. But I think it's very, very important to hear your perspective, Mariana, and kind of where the opportunities might lie. I'm going to grab on to the fact that you raised 301s, because a big part of the president's announcement on Friday, or at least a part that felt big to me, I paid a lot of attention to it, was the fact that we'd be mandating a series of 301 investigations. That's been raised already today. I'm going to ask Kellyanne to look at her tea leaves and to maybe share with us how that move might reverberate in the region. We obviously already have a 301 investigation ongoing with Brazil since the summer. I don't think it's been moving terribly quickly, but it is the broadest, at least that I'm aware of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, from a breadth perspective, the broadest 301 investigation, at least that I'm aware of. And certainly from what USTR has said, it sounds like the upcoming investigations might be equally broad and intense. So just would love your views on that and how that might reverberate in Latin America.
Sure, and I have to qualify that I missed Jennifer Thornton's comments earlier, so hopefully I won't contradict anything she shared about this.
Committed to nothing.
To nothing.
So
Perfect.
speculate like
Perfect.
crazy.
Then, all right, blank page. So look, Section 122 is obviously the tool that the administration has already applied, effective at 12:01 a.m. this morning. That authority lasts for 150 days, and so if the administration wants to apply tariffs beyond that date, they either need Congress or they need to find some other authority, right? And so what they've signaled is that they want to use this 301 tool as a way to look at discriminatory actions around the world, and that an investigation, which will be completed in expedited fashion, could take something like up to 5 months, which would fit nicely within that 150-day period, would then potentially be a measure that the administration could use to impose tariffs. And there could be other things that they do as well. I think we'll hear more over the next few days and weeks as some of these measures roll out. But the 301 investigations that have been described by USTR in Friday night's press release, as well as by various administration officials, have been described in terms of topics, right? So we've heard them talk about a 301 into excess capacity and overcapacity, into rice, into labor practices, into digital trade, pharmaceutical practices. So you can start to see, at least by some of the 301s that they have discussed, or the possible subjects of investigations, that a lot of them seem quite targeted at Asia, as well as Europe and other areas around the world. And some of them might end up targeting South America and the Western Hemisphere countries too. But I don't think we really know where any of this is going. So what I'd say is right now we've got this 10% tariff. It could go up to 15% in the next few days if there's an additional proclamation. But with most countries, prior to Friday, we had a 10% tariff, most Western Hem countries, and there were some variations there, with certain carve-outs and exemptions that are largely replicated now. So it could be that this policy continues, that they have the authority and they continue largely the same policy with the Western Hem, and that they target more specifically Asia and other types of supply chains to achieve just what it sounds like Jennifer said, and my point from the first intervention, which is drawing more supply chains to the Western Hemisphere by providing preferential treatment, preferential market access, trying to create more certainty and stabilities for business, that if you set up shop here, not only are we going to create the rules so that China can't get the benefit of your bargain and other countries can't get the benefit of your bargain, but that we're going to create a structure in which we're continuing to incentivize you to build here, produce here, particularly for critical supply chains. So I think directionally that's where they're heading with both the 301 and the 232 strategies. But this, we didn't get here overnight. I think for decades we sort of walked into some of the market failures that we're in. And so it's going to take a little bit to wake ourselves up and sort of recreate some of the supply chains in a way that actually does near shore, friend shore, allied shore, whatever term of art you want to use, towards the Western Hem that mirrors the Monroe Doctrine national security aspect.
No, that's helpful, Kellyanne, because I guess I have PTSD from the Brazil 301. I've been wondering if implementation of the arts don't go well, Ricardo, that maybe there'd be this temptation to file a 301 just to have it kind of like hanging over, the country's shoulder versus the kind of thematic approach that you're laying out. I think that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, and clearly, the president has used the IEEPA authority for all sorts of tariffs, not just the reciprocal tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, but some of these national security secondary tariffs on Venezuela, Cuba, Russian oil. So he's used them for a lot of purposes. We haven't seen what measure the administration is going to potentially imposed to give the president the authority to recreate some of these more foreign policy tariffs that might target individual countries in Latin America. Maybe they roll something out, maybe they don't, but we'll have to see. That's sort of a question mark at the moment.
Yeah, it's hard to see what the vehicle would be. I know the answer to this, but I just have to. It's a panel talking about the overlap between national security and economic security. 232 is a section that should be based on national security. Yeah. And if we, as part of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, are positing that hemispheric security is US national security, shouldn't we be thinking about doing some carve-outs for these 232s for our hemispheric? I know they're not talking about it, but shouldn't we be?
I guess it depends on the topic. And I don't know if the question was directed towards.
It's more to you,
Yeah.
but
So it depends on the issue. So a lot of the 232s we've seen, like steel and aluminum from the first administration, the challenge was China. It was Chinese excess capacity, it was Chinese unfair trade practices that were distorting global markets. And so the US effectively adopted this ring of tariffs around our economy to try to prevent that price distortion and encourage domestic production. But they have been open, and the Biden administration was open to this too, of cutting deals with countries who wanted to adopt similar tariffs, similar protections, so that we can trade internally on preferential terms, but create that wall externally. So the same could be true with some of these other sectors, but there are different challenges, like the copper 232. You mentioned Chile is a huge producer of copper. That's not specifically just a China challenge. No. And so when you're looking at critical minerals, when you're looking at chips, semiconductors, pharmaceutical products, all of these supply chains are different. Mm-hmm. So they might create sort of a different patchwork of potential protections where there is a national security threat, but where there's not a national security threat and you have a willing partner who is also willing to impose the types of protections that are required, I think there is an argument for lowering tariffs in that instance.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for those thoughts. I'd like to talk just a moment about efforts in the hemisphere to diversify trade. As we were talking about before, I think everybody is trying to be as engaged as they can with the United States, but also considering what their options are, right? Mm-hmm. Mariana, you were Colombia's ambassador to India. It feels like everyone's going to India. I think Prime Minister Carney's going later this week. Ricardo, we had the EU-Mercosur deal, which I used to joke that maybe my grandkids would see it go into effect.
I never believed it.
Still might be true, by the way. We'll see. But it moved. That was exciting. And Diego, I believe you participated in the incredibly impressive Canadian delegation to Mexico City recently, which was I think the largest Canadian business delegation I remember. Ever going to Mexico City. Would love to hear from each of you, just whatever you'd like to say as far as what you are seeing with respect to trade diversification efforts, and how feasible are. I mean, geography always wins, right? I mean, our economies are intertwined for a reason. Mm-hmm. Some of that is policy efforts over the years. Some of that is distance and logic. Just would love your thoughts, Ricardo. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, look. So first of all, the geography determines this, and the geoeconomy determines it. The more exposure you have. So Brazil, farther from the United States, more diversified trading relationships is going to have less pressure than Guatemala or anything north of Panama. I mean, for sure. On the other hand, the United States is the largest destination for value-added Brazilian goods, for manufactured goods. And so they can't. That's not a relationship they can completely do away with. It's very. I would say if you're particularly in South America, really everywhere. I mean, there's a reality that there is a certain hedging with respect to the United States now because you can't be sure of it. And so, the businesses. This is not government. These are businesses that are having to decide where can I be assured of a market over time. They are looking more at Europe, and Europe is aggressively marketing itself as a more stable sort of trading partner, especially in South America, less so in Central America. I think with respect to what we aren't seeing, though, is very clear, undisputed patterns that businesses can take a cue from in the Americas. There's not massive movement from Asia yet to the Western Hemisphere because there isn't yet I will just say this. I spent the last year urging clients from Latin America that came to Washington not to say nearshoring. Yes. Understand the culture and the perspective of this administration, how you fit in there. not like how it's going to go well for business in your country is not important to this USTR at all.
Facilitating jobs in the United
That's
States
it.
of America.
And you have to make that case. And if you can't make that case, you're not going to be as successful as somebody who does. And that's sort of an adjustment. But I think it also meant that they have had to start thinking about India, Asia, and it's not just in terms of trading partners, but in terms of what kind of investment do they want. The Gulf states are very active now in Latin America. It's the same thing. I mean, you're just seeing a pretty significant expansion of exploration, not done deals.
Yeah.
Mariana.
In the case of India, I was Colombian ambassador to India, is quite interesting. India's soft power has become very subtle. I was telling Kellie, it's like yoga in a hot tub. They move very easy. Minister Jai Shankar and Minister Gokal
Very charming.
Just go. They're very charming. But I think Tim Cook, president of Apple, understood India very well. You know, Apple is expanding in India, now is exporting. 75% of Apple's iPhones are now made in India. And now in Latin America, India is expanding. UPL, for example, is the fourth largest agrochemical company, is expanding in Brazil. Modi, Prime Minister Modi and Lula, very good friends, are part of BRICS. In Colombia, Indians in investment is very, very active and expanding. And one thing I must say to your point in China is that India has no strings attached. There is no BRT attached. You know, they just come and they look in for the long term. They don't care about, you know, tariffs. They don't care about that. They look for the long term. In case, for example, of the pharmaceutical companies, IT companies, pharmaceuticals look for generics, which is patient-oriented pricing, IT databases and data centers. So it's a
lot's
different
going
type.
on.
It's a different type of investment, very long-term oriented, and not no strings attached, which is different from Chinese investment.
No, thank you. Diego, I
point.
want to hear more about the
Yes.
Canadian delegation.
Yeah, quick
I was
point
so
on-
intrigued by it.
Quick point on the Canadian delegation. The positives is that it was a turning point in Mexico-Canada relations. We went from being distant neighbors again after a few comments made in November 2024 by Premier Ford and Premier Smith. Then those were echoed by Prime Minister Trudeau. The Mexicans and the Canadians weren't talking to each other for a while, and this is just evidence that the relationship is past that stage, and we're actually working on ways to trade more with each other, not through the United States. Mm-hmm. There were over 2,000 business-to-business meetings there. Canadian government officials met with Mexican government officials. There's a really important conversation now on port-to-port logistics. That's the only way that Mexico and Canada can trade with each other more without going through the U.S. What I must say is that one of the things that was missing, obviously one was a security conversation between Mexico and Canada. Both were subject to AIPA tariffs. But most importantly, I think, is that the narrative of the visit was still competitiveness. Mm-hmm. We are stronger together, and I mean, that's factually true. But I think that's not the, if we want to have an impact here in Washington, we have to frame it a little bit differently. It would be a mistake to assume that you can continue to integrate as we have done in the past 30 years, and to think that the competitive lens alone it still defines the moment and will get us there. As we've mentioned throughout the panel, the stated objective of this U.S. administration is homeshoring, not nearshoring, not supply chain resiliency. The objective is control over production, over strategic resources, over technology. That said, I think Latin America still maintains a very different relationship compared to any other regions in the world when it comes to their relationship with the U.S. And I think all things said and done, that's where the economic reality and the strategic considerations will eventually reassert themselves. The United States cannot close China's head start in critical minerals production, AI, defense, semiconductors, without working closely with its Latin American partners, and particularly with Mexico and with Canada. And if this administration is serious about economic and national security, we'll need deeper cooperation with Latin America. And this is where agreements like USMCA or this other bilateral frameworks will be super important. We are renegotiating USMCA not in a competitiveness era, we're doing it in an economic security era. Homeshoring, if it remains purely national, it will be costly, it will be incomplete. If it becomes a coordinated regional strategy, you'll have a higher chance to succeed. And I think, to Kellie's point, I think that's where agreements like USMCA could evolve from a traditional market access agreement into something much larger, into a platform for economic security. And that obviously was missing from the Canadian delegation, but I think that would be the logical next step. And I'm really hoping that we get to those conversations before July 1st, 2026.
Yeah, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. Thanks to each of you for your amazing insights, to Ken for the platform, and to all of you for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Those were great.